It's a clear teaching, and that's it. She said, so tomorrow I'm going to go up to Ned, and I'm going to say, hey, Ned, did you know that there are 2 different creation stories in the Bible, and God is saying said different things about how God created the world? There are different orders and everything, and I'm going to step back, and I'm going to watch his head explode. And then she closed up the Bible, and she walked off to her room and shut the door, and he could hear her whistling in there. Well, Ken was intrigued by this, and so he walked over to the family bookshelf, and he pulled off the family Bible that they had there. They didn't read it as a family, but they had it in case of emergencies. And so he pulled it off, and he started reading at chapter 2. And he read this 2nd chapter of Genesis over and over again. I didn't pay much attention to the part where Eve is created from the rib of Adam. He just figured that would get him in trouble in his marriage. He let that be. But he noticed some other things. That both the animals and the human beings are created out of the same dust of the ground. And it doesn't seem like the animals are all that less important. They're just not partners for the human. And then he started looking at this verse 15. And he couldn't stop looking at it, how God places Adam in the garden to till it and keep it. Ken had discovered that God's work for human beings is to take care of creation. And he felt a sense of hope, this small glimmer of hope. Even after those emails that Nick had been sending day after day, he felt a little hope, and he felt like this was even calling him home in a way. And then he thought, well, this is crazy. I'm a man's man. What am I, turning into some sort of tree hugger or something? I work for Harley Davidson, for crying out loud. Every day I go into work in this steel and concrete box with these huge robotic machines all around me. I make dangerous machines for people to ride. Now that's the real world. It's industry and technology that make the world go around, not some garden. A garden's pretty, but it's just to the side. It's a hobby, but it's not the center of life. It can't be the center of life, right? And then he started thinking about work, and then he got angry again. And then his mind started wandering off to his most cherished childhood memories. You see, when Ken was a boy, before he could do the farm work with his dad and his brother, he worked out in the garden with his grandfather. Every day his grandfather would drive onto the yard in his shiny green Pontiac Le Mans, and he'd get out of it and he'd walk into the house and he'd say, where's my helper? I need Kenny. And Kenny would come down the stairs, and his grandfather would put a straw hat in his head, and they'd go outside in the garden with their little matching straw hats, and they'd start working. Now Ken's grandfather could have done everything twice as fast as if he'd been working on his own, but he was never in any hurry. So Ken had a chance to do everything. He tilled the soil, he planted the seeds, he watered, he weeded, and he harvested everything. And then later in the summer, a lot of the work moved into the kitchen. And there he worked with his grandmother, and they canned tomatoes, and they put up pickles, and they pickled onions and carrots and beets, and they made applesauce, and they made jams and jellies. But the garden wasn't just about work, because his grandfather told stories. He told lots and lots of stories. He told stories about what life was like growing up on the farm when he was a kid, about how his chores were bringing in the corn cobs for the cook stoves. He told about what it was like to farm with horses and the fear and thrill of driving the team of horses for the first time. He told stories about how his dad was the most stubborn man in the county, and everyone called him over to help break their horses for them. And he told stories of the things they did for fun, how they swam in the lake in the summertime, and how they skated on the lake in the winter. And he told the story of how he and Ken's grandmother fell in love. They were around each other their whole lives. Their families were friends. And then one 4th of July, they were walking together, and they started holding hands, and it surprised them. And they were suddenly in love. Nobody else was surprised, but they were. And he told stories of food, of the menus of Thanksgiving and Christmas and Easter and 4th of July, and he couldn't tell these stories without the saliva building up in his mouth and having to swallow, and he'd say, oh, that's good, that was good. And then once the stories dried up, Ken would start noticing all the creation that was around him in the garden. And he noticed the bees lugging pollen from one flower to the next, and a robin pulling an earthworm out of the ground, and the earthworm hanging on for dear life, and a mole digging a tunnel through the beets and onions, and he chased the bunny rabbit out of the lettuce. And he noticed everything fit together, and he had a place there. He fit in the garden too. Creation surrounded him. The beans and the corn and the tomatoes were taller than he was. The swallows were swooping all around. The soil was churning with life under his feet. His grandfather was over here, this living history of human life and work and love, telling stories like a spring bubbling out of the side of the mountain. Now, maybe this was the center of life, Ken thought. Creation and its gifts of food, and the way that food nourishes our bodies and nourishes our relationships and connects us across the generations and gives us a sense of place. Maybe this is the center of life, and we've lost our way, and God is calling us back. Well, Ken shut the Bible, put it back on the shelf, and walked out to the backyard to where his own small garden plot was. He didn't have the big plot that his family did, but he had what he wanted. He had some carrots and onions, peppers, tomatoes, cucumbers. He realized he still felt like a child when he was in that place. He still felt that awe and wonder at creation. He still felt like he fit there. And he also remembered his grandfather when he was in the garden. He could remember more of the stories in that place. And he'd invite his children out to work with him. And he'd tell the stories again to his children and tell more of his own stories to the children. The last 5 years or so, Ken had started raising heirloom tomatoes. The weirder, the better. All these strange varieties. Green stripes, purple ones, yellow ones, orange ones, brown ones, the type that have the teardrop shape, and the big, ugly, bumpy ones. He raised them all. And what happened was when the fall came, he had way too many tomatoes than he could possibly eat. So he started filling them up in baskets. He'd take them every place he went. Even on Monday nights, when he went down to meet the fellas at the bar to watch Monday Night Football, he'd bring these heirloom tomatoes with him down there. At first, the guys made fun of him. They started calling him Weird Tomato and Saucy and other names like that. But the basket was always empty at the end of the night. And then the bartender started bringing in these hot peppers that he was raising in his garden. And he started daring the guys to eat them around the bar in the evening. And then they started making their own salsa with the peppers and with the tomatoes. And they'd eat and they'd drink and they'd tell stories until they realized that the game had ended a half an hour ago. Ken walked into the garden to the tomatoes. Till the garden and keep it, he said to himself. Stay close to creation and close to one another, he mumbled to himself. He felt that God was nudging him, that God was nudging all of us. If what Nick was saying was true, maybe God was pleading with us too. But he felt that his heart was lighter. He wasn't really worried about Nick's emails. He wasn't really thinking about going into work the next morning. He was just thinking about picking a few tomatoes, having a good supper, and telling some stories around the table. And that seemed like a gift. And he pledged as well to be tilling the garden and keeping it from this day on. Amen.